Hello, my name is Dr. Vicky Cleak and I'm a consultant psychiatrist with a special interest in adult ADHD. And today I'm going to talk about the neurobiology of ADHD, looking at which structures of the brain are involved and what impact that can have on you and your ADHD. I hope it gives you a greater depth of understanding about ADHD and that you find it really useful. So when I have a patient where they have a new diagnosis of ADHD, I give them this model, which I think explains some of the things we're going to go into in more depth and will explain some of the difficulties that people with ADHD have. So I give them the model of a car and a car pedal. Someone with ADHD has got a very sticky pedal. So if they're doing something they're very excited about, a task they have chosen to do that they really enjoy, they often get into a mode of hyperfocus. And that's where the pedal is pushed down but gets stuck. So that although they're able to focus really amazingly on the task at hand, the problem is that they don't notice when they get thirsty, hungry, if the doorbell rings, if they are tired, and thus that can be a bit of a problem. It also can be a bit of a problem for family members. So if your wife or your partner comes over to you and asks you to get involved with some other task, it will be really hard for them to get through to you. Shouting may not make any difference at all. This is why you often have to shout up the stairs 10 times to get your child with ADHD to come down for their dinner. Sometimes it involves them coming over to you and literally tapping you on the shoulder, shaking you. And at that point, because the person is still involved in their task, they may be able to go and do whatever it is that you want them to do, like have their dinner, sign for the parcel at the door, but they will be exceedingly discombobulated by it. So although they're physically doing that, their mind is still back in that task, and that can lead to irritability and a real disconnect with what's going on in the moment. But if a person with ADHD is asked to do a task that they find really boring, they've put off for a really long time, like filling out their tax return, what can happen is they may not even find the pedal because the pedal is too small. And if they do find the pedal because it's got a bit bigger due to a time pressure or someone standing over them, or someone's added a reward in to make it slightly more interesting, they can press down that pedal, but they can't press it down enough to be able to cut off from all the distractions going on around them, externally but also internally. And so that means it takes longer to get the job done, they make more errors, they may go off and forget that they were in the middle of a task and not come back to it. So let's look at what is going on in the brain that underpins this experience for those with ADHD and that sticky pedal. We can think about the brain being split into several areas. Each of these areas have got several specific structures involved, but as a broad brush, your prefrontal cortex, which is the bit right at the front of your head, is the newest part of our brains, which some people say makes us human, and as a result of that it matures a bit later than all the other areas into your 20s. The prefrontal cortex is involved in a number of more mature abilities, such as being able to prioritise and make decisions based on all the information available rather than being driven primarily by emotions. It is important for decision making, understanding your emotions, all your executive functions such as planning, adjusting to new situations, solving problems, your working memory, so that scratch pad of being able to take down someone's phone number to be able to then put it into longer storage by rehearsing it in the front of your mind. And also is important for ability to stay focused on a task in hand. So you can see that those with ADHD struggle with some of those things, and there is probably some difficulty with how that prefrontal cortex is functioning in those with ADHD. Your limbic system, on the other hand, is the oldest part of your brain, and this is the part that connects your body to the brain through the vagal nerve. It is involved in regulating emotions, emotional memories, where those emotions are processed, and that is often where the root of PTSD is seated. But one of its main functions is in survival. So it tells the body how to respond in your fight, flight, fright response, as well as being the driver for motivations around food, sex, all those important survival aspects. And then we have the basal ganglia, which is involved in movement control, and obviously those with ADHD are hyperactive. It's also involved in forming habits and making activity automatic, so that you don't have to spend lots of effort and time learning and relearning certain tasks, such as driving. It's also involved to some extent in emotional processing and in motivation and drive, and in evaluating goals and the risk benefit of actions. And finally, the reticular activating system, which is essentially a motorway of connection between certain parts of your brain, and it's really important for regulating your sleep and wake cycles, your attention, and essentially acts as a filter or gatekeeper to incoming stimuli. It sorts out between all of those things to decide what's important to pay attention to or not. We know from animal studies as well as human studies that ADHD affects all of these areas of the brain, and in different people to different extents. So if we zoom in a little bit further, we can see that there are structural differences in the brain between those with ADHD and those without ADHD through functional MRI, and also in terms of structural differences that we can see on magnetic resonance imaging. As I mentioned before, those with ADHD tend to have a brain that matures a little bit slower, so with a delay in cortical thickness and slower changes to that prefrontal cortex region of the brain. And some of those changes seem to disappear when a person is given stimulant medication. And those changes include both improved connectivity between regions of the brain, but also in terms of volumes of areas in the brain. And again, if we zoom even further down to the actual neurons themselves, we can see that there are differences between those with ADHD and those who are neurologically typical, in that those with ADHD may have reduced amounts of dopamine receptors and reduced amounts of synaptic dopamine. So there is either a greater reuptake of the dopamine, or there is less release of dopamine from the neurons themselves, and that is what stimulants specifically target. But it's not just about dopamine. There's also a significant part that noradrenaline plays in ADHD, and we can think about these two neurotransmitters as having quite different but synergistic roles. So if we think about the dopamine as reducing the noise in the brain, turning the noise down, so reducing the number of distractions externally and internally, the distractions going on, whereas the noradrenaline strengthens the signal, so turns up the focus on what it is you're doing. So if the two work together well, then you're able to focus your attention on what you want when you want to. And finally, zooming even further down onto the cells themselves and looking at our genetics, our genes. We know that there are differences in the genetics of those with ADHD. ADHD strongly runs in families. You've got more than 50% chance of having ADHD if you've got a parent with ADHD, and the risks increase if you have a non-identical twin, and even more so if you've got an identical twin. Doesn't necessarily mean you're going to have ADHD, but genetics clearly has a large part to play in whether or not you get ADHD. There is no one gene that causes ADHD, and in fact scientists have found that at least 103 different genetic differences between those with ADHD and those without. We also know that it's not just about the number of genes you have, it's also about whether those are switched on or switched off, i.e. expressed. And the things that can lead to that happening include such things as your exposure to toxins in the womb or in childhood, and those toxins can be both environmental, such as pollution, smoking, drinking, but can also be sort of behavioural. So if you're abused or neglected, you're more likely to develop ADHD than if you were not exposed to that. And that's because genes are expressed, i.e. switched on and off, by all of these other things going on. ADHD is a product of the underlying genetics, but also the environment you're born into. And I go into that in one of the other modules talking about family. So we've looked at the parts of the brain that are involved in ADHD, the structures of the brain down to the neurons and onto the genetics, where there are differences between those with ADHD and those without. And so if we now zoom out to the bigger picture, and if we think about measurable differences between those with ADHD and those without, we know that those with ADHD have objectively poorer working memories. They have more variability in their reaction times, and that's probably because they're distracted. They are more likely to make omission errors, so miss things like questions on the back of the paper, or missing that there was a decimal point in a number when they're doing a maths exam. There are differences with non-verbal fluency and response inhibition, so your ability to stop and think before acting. We can measure those, and we know there are differences between populations of ADHD and those without. So in summary, those with ADHD have objective differences in functioning, which are reflected by differences in the underlying brain structure, as well as neuronal function and genetics. So I hope you found this module useful. Thank you for watching.